of the modern city, flushing out the truth about sewage.
Ducking under a wave, seeing a panty line or a condom there, and you being unable to avoid it without risking injury from your surfboard, and it's going straight onto your face, is about as gross as you want to get. When we go surfing, it's often in a soup of other people's excrement.
Humans have always been regular and prodigious producers of waste. The problem has always been how to get rid of it.
Now from all parts the swelling kennels flow and bear their trophies with them as they go. Filths of all hues and colours seem to tell what street they sailed from by their sight or smell. Sweepings from butcher's stalls, dung, guts and blood, drowned puppies, stinking sprats, all drenched in mud. Dead cats and turnip tops come tumbling down the flood.
This was how Swift described London in the early 18th century. Up until the middle of the 19th century, the cities of the world were united by one thing, their stink. London was the biggest city, so that's where the stink was worst. Horses and cattle were leaving 3 million tonnes of droppings on the streets of English towns, 20,000 on London alone. At the same time, humans added their own daily contribution. The French phrase garder l'eau means mind the water. It's where the word loo comes from. Even the clean-living Romans had to raise their pavements 1.5 feet above the roadway to keep their sandals clear of the mire. They placed tall stepping stones to cross the streets. Living in stink was a way of life, but the Romans made it into an art. Public lavatories were public meeting places, with marble benches with armrests, central heating, mosaics. Perfumed oils burnt and fountains played. They even had gods dedicated to defecation. Offerings were made to Stachys and Crepitus, the gods of ordure and conveniences, and Cloacina, goddess of the common sewer. Although running water carried away the endeavours of the Romans, it only carried them to the Tiber, which became filthier and filthier. As a result, like everywhere else, Rome stank. When Dick Whittington arrived in London in the 15th century, he found that the streets were certainly not paved with gold. As Lord Mayor, he had the idea of building the biggest ever public loo in Greenwich Street. Over a long gully opening onto the river, 64 men and 64 women sat on 2 long rows of seats, cheek to cheek. It was called Whittington's Longhouse. There were no partitions, but no embarrassment. Embarrassment hadn't been invented yet. It wasn't long before brass was being made from the muck. The rakers or gong firmers, whose job it was to empty the cesspits, were very highly paid, for this work was as perilous as it was dirty. Everyone knew the fate of Richard the raker, who lost his footing to drown in excrement. Throughout the Middle Ages, human waste was seen as a valuable resource. It was collected from the city by night soil men and sold to farmers to return to the land, filth to tilth, just as the Romans had done and as the Chinese still do. A lively trade developed from this ready market. One inventive entrepreneur became the first human public convenience. His bucket was available to anyone who could afford to spend a penny.
This device of mine requires not a sea full of water, but a cistern.
In 1594 came the idea which would eventually revolutionise the scent of man. For his royal godmother, Queen Elizabeth I, Sir John Harrington devised a self-emptying slop pan. It had a trap which opened and was then rinsed with water from a cistern. He wrote up the instructions as an elaborate literary joke, but Her Majesty was not amused. The royal flush didn't catch on, otherwise we might well be going for a Harrington today. Unfortunately, Sir John had been 200 years ahead of his time. Households, even very grand ones, continued to stink. In 1660, Samuel Pepys, writing from the aptly named Seething Lane, noted,
Going down to my cellar, I put my foot into a great heap of turds, by which I find that Mr. Turner's house of office is full, and comes into my cellar, which doth trouble me.
The smell and the mess lingered on for another 100 years. The breakthrough came in 1775. A Bond Street watchmaker named Alexander Cummings resurrected Harrington's idea. But he added a vital improvement. He realised that if he curved the soil pipe into an S shape, a valuable water trap would be created. The waste could be washed away as before, but the stink couldn't return through the impenetrable water barrier. The water closet had arrived. Now, at the flush of a handle, your waste could cease to be your problem and become someone else's.
I think humans, and particularly modern humans, have always had a philosophy about things that they wish to get rid of. You either burn it, bury it, or throw it in the sea, or indeed into the nearest local watercourse. And the number of supermarket trolleys that you can spot in any average river by looking over the bridge bears testimony to that. We also tend to operate an out of sight, out of mind ethic almost when it comes to these things, and certainly there are very, very good reasons why one should avoid handling one's own excrement, but unfortunately the solution that we've come up with simply produces huge amounts of polluted water.
At the end of the 18th century, nobody had thought of this. Here was the solution everyone had been waiting for, and by 1797, one manufacturer had sold some 6,000 of the new WCs. But no one had considered where all the extra water was going to go. It poured down into the cesspits and burst them open. Sewage welled up through floorboards and sloshed down the streets. The gurgling brooks, which had once supplied London's drinking water, turned to open sewers. As the stench became unbearable, the rivers were covered over and forgotten. Out of sight, out of mind. But beneath the streets, the putrid, inflammable gases began to build up. In 1846 came the consequences. One of the biggest of the smothered rivers, the Fleet, exploded. A tidal wave of sewage erupted out over the poorhouses, and a Thames steamboat was smashed against Blackfriars Bridge. The stinking river which gave Fleet Street its name was back, bearing the trophies of London's abattoirs, gasworks, dye works, glue works, bone works, tanneries, chemical works, and the contents of London's sewers. Needless to say, it was the poor who suffered most.
Sir, we ain't got no privies, no dustbins, no water supplies, and no drain or sewer in the old place. The stench of a gully hole is disgusting. We all of us suffer, and numbers are ill. And if a cholera comes, Lord help us, we are living like pigs.
In 1849, this desperate letter was published. Cholera did indeed come. While the prosperous West End drew most of their drinking water from upstream, the poor ended up drinking their own effluent. And with every flush, this waterborne disease was spread further.
Grandmother, grandmother, tell me the truth. How many years am I going to live? 1, 2, 3, 4...
Out of every 1,000 children, 153 didn't survive. London was dying from lack of drains. The summer of 1858 was long and stiflingly hot. Paddle steamers churned the Thames into stinking eddies. The smell was so bad that the windows of the Houses of Parliament had to be draped with curtains soaked in chloride of lime. 1858 would become known as the year of the big stink. Tons of chalk lime and carbolic acid were tipped into the river in an attempt to control the smell, but the stink wouldn't go away. The problem had at last reached the noses of those who could do something about it. A bill was brought within a fortnight. A select committee set up to find a way of reducing the stench. The brief: to clean up London. More than 140 schemes were considered, including one which used vacuum tubes to suck sewage from the affluent West End to the effluent East End. The winning scheme was eventually put forward by a tiny man with a remarkably fine set of whiskers, the engineer to the Metropolitan Board of Works, Joseph Bazalgette. Experimenting with floats, Bazalgette discovered that the piston effect of the tide meant that sewage entering the river at the West End would float 10 miles out on the ebb tide, but then float 9.5 miles back again on the next tide. Back under the noses of Parliament. He discovered that it could take up to 50 days of toing and froing for the sewage to reach the sea, stinking all the way. Planning to carry the sewage out through a system of underground tunnels, he needed to work out the point nearest to London where the sewage could safely be discharged without it drifting back upstream into the city. Bazalgette's finger alighted on the hapless inhabitants of Crossness on the south side of the river and the village of Barking on the north. At last there would be a chance of sweet-smelling water. Bazalgette's main drainage scheme was to be one of the great engineering feats of the Victorian age. The intrepid journalist John Hollingshead was one of the first to report on the magnificent undertaking.
Feeling a desire to inspect a main sewer almost from its source to its point of discharge into the Thames, I applied to the proper authorities and was obligingly told that they had not the slightest objection to gratifying what they evidently thought a very singular taste. I felt like a bear in a pit at the Zoological Gardens as I descended. The downward flood pressed rather heavily against the back of my legs, and the bottom was ragged and uncertain. When I caught a glimpse of the water which I was wading in above my knees, I saw It was as black as ink.
Bazalgette's system was the first in the world to integrate two functions, both a drain for rainwater and a sewer for foul water. It would carry the sewage away by the simplest method of all, gravity.
Mr. Bazalgette's plan is 3 vast tunnels on the north side of the Thames, extending from west to east, and 2 vast tunnels on the south side. These will cut through at different levels, intercepting the daily millions of gallons of sewage and carry them away to the river. The great middle-level sewer begins an egg-shaped tunnel.
Bazalgette built his sewer tunnels in the shape of an upturned egg. To keep the sewage on the move, he worked out that the minimum gradient was a drop of 2 feet per mile. An egg shape meant that the lower the water level, the faster the flow, and so the more effective the scouring of the sewers. London of the 1870s, as portrayed by the engraver Gustave Doré, was a transformed city. 1,000 miles of sewers now carried away the filth of rich and poor alike, as they still do today. As Bazalgette himself observed,
The habits of the population of various parts of London are indicated by the flow of sewage. The maximum flow in the fashionable parts of the West End being 2 or 3 hours later than those of the East End.
the contents of a lavatory flushed in, say, Fulham, now began an underground journey of some 17 miles. No longer checked by disease, London's population began to grow and grow.
There's no doubt that the sewerage infrastructure that the Victorians put together has saved a great deal of problems in terms of typhoid and cholera and polio outbreaks, and of course these things have also been helped by the big vaccination programs. But unfortunately it's a classic example of one of those things where there is no such thing as a free lunch, because all you're doing is taking your problem and transporting it elsewhere.
This is precisely what Bazalgette had done. Only 3 years after the grand official opening celebrations of his new sewers came the consequences. On the 3rd of September 1878, the Princess Alice, a paddle steamer, collided with a 900-ton coal barge on the river near Barking and sank. 623 perished. At first, the passengers were thought to have drowned, but during the inquest, the first doubts were put forward by a pharmaceutical chemist.
When 600 are plunged into a river only a mile wide, it is astonishing that only 5 or 6 should have saved their lives by swimming. The reason? There is projected into the river 2 continuous columns of decomposed fermenting sewage, hissing like soda water with baneful gases, so black that the water is stained for miles and discharging a corrupt charnel house odour, a true poison, as fatal as prussic acid.
One witness said that the water, both for taste and smell, was something he could hardly describe. The issue was back on the doorstep of Westminster. Action duly followed, and the first rudimentary sewage treatment was initiated. The solid matter was separated into a sludge, loaded onto barges, which would become affectionately known as gravy boats, and dumped in the sea. By 1887, only liquid effluent was being run into the river. All seemed well again. Meanwhile, wealthy Londoners were getting used to a new, white, disinfected, vitreous-glazed world. WCs sprouted like mushrooms. The age of the sanitary baron had arrived. The privy councillors, of whose names we're still reminded at least twice a day: Shanks, Johns, Armitage, Twyford, and of course the immortal Crapper. Competition was highest for the most effective flush. The record was set in 1884 by the Jennings pedestal vase.
10 apples. 1 flat sponge. 3 ping-pong balls. Plumber's grease. 4 pieces of paper.
Even the apprentice's cap went down the pan. The magnificent flushing machine could wash away anything. As trickling spirals of water gave way to mighty torrents, the brand names reflected the fact. But though the new efficiency brought hygiene, it also brought something else. Prudery. By 1900, the population of Greater London was 6 million. By 1930, 8 million, twice what Bazalgette had planned for, yet his mighty sewers were coping. The Thames, unfortunately, was not.
Now, the water was pretty bad in the 30s. No fish, of course. No one ever dreamed of fishing in the River Thames. The smell wasn't too bad. At low water in certain places where it was muddy, you'd get a bit of a smell, but it was just bad. But nothing like it was after the war. The river was so bad that you could smell it for some distance away. The Woolwich ferries, at low water, being paddle steamers, they seemed to churn it up more than anybody else. And the smell was terrible. It actually turned white paint brown. Now, it didn't matter when the white paint on our barges turned brown, but you can imagine the ship owners. Did they have a moan? Passenger ships coming into the Royal Docks, painted white all round, one trip, and their white paint turned brown. It must have cost them a fortune.
Effluent discharged at Barking gradually began to poison waters further and further upstream. Bacteria multiplied and multiplied, consuming the life-giving oxygen dissolved in the water. The river, which had once supplied 130 salmon each day to Billingsgate Fish Market, began literally to choke. In 1947, in late summer, the Thames died. For 7 miles from Westminster to Barking, the water was black and chemically lifeless, 80% raw sewage.
When detergents came to be used in the late 40s, you could see possibly an 8-inch covering of brown froth all over the river. And it would, on a day like this, it would be blowing all over the place. And you'd wish that perhaps you'd rather not be afloat.
This ain't no technological breakdown. Oh no, this is the road to hell.
One noticeable thing was that as men in those days were apt to drop their condoms down the drain, you'd see them floating about, and they're indestructible. So you'd find those which are a few days old and those that are many weeks old, and they'd come up with the flood and down with the ebb. Just one of those, the Thames goldfish, as we used to call them.
In fact, we did restore the Thames to health, but we chose to treat the consequence rather than the cause. Vast sums were spent on sophisticated new sewage treatment works, built to cope with the 70 gallons of sewage produced per person per day. The sewage was comprehensively processed. Tanks settled out the sediment, and the aerated liquid was broken down by bacteria. In 1974, even the salmon returned. However, the cleaner it became, the more filth we threw at it.
The apocryphal statement that one often hears about drinking water in London having passed through 7 pairs of kidneys before you drink your glass of water there is very, very close to the truth. What we tend to do is produce a lot of sewage, treat it, discharge it to the river. A little further down there'll be an abstraction point. The water's abstracted and then cleaned up. Very wasteful of resources.
The WC has proved so irresistible it's created a new culture, a culture of disposability. First came hard and shiny lavatory paper, introduced at the turn of the century. Shortage of bandages in the First World War led to field dressings of disposable paper wadding. In 1916, soft lavatory paper was introduced. The disposable sanitary towel followed in the 1920s. In the 1930s, the tampon, and then the condom. In the 50s came coloured lavatory paper. In the late 60s, the panty liner and the disposable nappy. Since Bazalgette completed his sewer system, London's population has increased by 23%. The amount of sewage received for treatment has increased by 275%. More than 4 million rolls of lavatory paper are now made every day, enough to stretch 4 times round the earth. The difficulty is in providing enough water to wash it away.
Sewage is chemically very complex. The washing up liquids, the bleaches, the various things for dyeing the water that nice colour blue in your toilet, bubble baths. We are living very much in a chemical culture in the home.
The average household uses more than 30,000 gallons of pure drinking water a year. 3,300 gallons of it we flush down the pan to remove waste which, left to decompose naturally, could be carried away in a bucket. Sanitary insanity. In the past, nature warned us of sanitary catastrophe by creating a big stink. In our sanitised, odourless, artificial world, there'll be no such warning. It's up to us. The water closet can't be uninvented, but it may have to be reinvented as the air closet or the earth closet. Otherwise, if we want to carry on flushing, we'll have to spend pounds, not pennies. But what if the money runs out?